My neighbor tried to claim I had built my pool on his property. In court, he brought photos as evidence. I presented the original blueprints and land survey, proving the pool was fully on my land. His lawyer didn't even try to argue. I've lived in my house for about 5 years now. It's in Phoenix, Arizona, in a quiet neighborhood with large backyards, where most people mind their business and just want to enjoy their space. When I first moved in, I had no issues with any of my neighbors. Everyone was friendly enough, some more talkative than others, but overall, it was a peaceful area. Except for one guy. The neighbor to my right, let's call him Brad, was the kind of person who always seemed annoyed about something. The first time I met him, he made a joke about how my grass was too green for someone who had just moved in. I laughed, thinking he was kidding. He wasn't. Over the years, I caught him staring over my fence more times than I could count. He complained about my trash cans being too close to his property line. He whined when I had a contractor redo my driveway. And whenever I had guests over, he would stand outside pretending to do yard work while staring at my house like I had personally invited him to eavesdrop. But I put up with it. Until the pool. I had always wanted a pool, and after saving up for years, I finally decided to have one installed. It wasn't some cheap DIY setup. I went through all the right channels. Permits. Approved. Professional land survey. Completed. Licensed contractors. Hired. Everything was above board. I made sure of it. Brad hated the idea of my pool. The second construction started, Brad was on my case. First, he complained about the noise. Okay, fair. It was loud. Construction isn't exactly a quiet process. But then he started getting weird. He told me I was destroying the neighborhood's aesthetic. Mind you, this is Arizona, almost everyone has a pool. Then he started making passive-aggressive comments about water waste while running his own sprinklers in the middle of the day during a heat wave. But the real problem came when the pool was nearly finished. I was outside checking on the progress when I saw Brad standing right at the property line, arms crossed, watching my pool like a hawk. I ignored him at first, but then he spoke. You know that's on my property, right? I thought he was joking. What? He smirked and pointed toward the deep end of my pool. You built that on my land. I was stunned. The pool wasn't even close to his yard. It was in the middle of my backyard, a good 10 feet from the fence. I told him he was mistaken. He shook his head and said he was pretty sure I had encroached on his property. I asked him what he was basing that on. That's when he gestured to a rusty metal stake sticking out of the ground a few feet from my fence. That's the original property marker, he said confidently. I stared at it. It looked like someone had literally just shoved it into the dirt. I told him the pool was well within my property, that I had a professional land survey done before construction even began. He just smirked again and said, "We'll see about that." I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed he was just being his usual annoying self. I was wrong. Brad took me to court. A few weeks later, I got served. Brad had actually filed a lawsuit against me. His claim? That my pool extended several feet onto his property and that I was decreasing his home's value by illegally building on his land. I laughed when I read the lawsuit. I thought, there's no way this is real. But it was. And I had no choice but to get a lawyer. During our first meeting, my lawyer asked me if I had any documents proving my property lines. Oh yeah, I said, I have the original deed, permits, and a professional land survey from before construction. My lawyer's face lit up. This is going to be easy. Brad's evidence. On the day of the hearing, Brad showed up acting like he had already won. He brought printed photos of my pool, a cheap tape measure, and, get this, a hand-drawn property map that looked like a child had sketched it. His lawyer was a young guy who seemed like he had just passed the bar. He looked uncomfortable, like he wasn't fully convinced of Brad's case but was too deep to back out now. When it was Brad's turn, he confidently showed the judge his evidence. He presented photos of my pool. He had his homemade map with his own property lines drawn in. He showed a tape measure with random numbers that were supposed to prove my pool was encroaching. Then, the best part, he told the judge about the official property stake he had found. That's when I knew he was going to lose. When it was my turn, I calmly handed over the original land survey, signed and stamped by a licensed surveyor. A copy of my deed, showing my exact property lines. The permits I had gotten for construction. Aerial photos from Google Maps, clearly showing where my fence had been for years. The judge took one look at my documents, then turned to Brad's lawyer. "Do you wish to contest any of this?" The room went silent. Brad's lawyer hesitated. Then he shook his head. "No, Your Honor." Brad turned bright red. "Brad loses it." Brad immediately started arguing with his own lawyer. He was red-faced, sweating, pointing fingers, insisting that I had somehow rigged the system. He started ranting about fraud and how the city had been paid off to approve my permits. The judge was not having it. "Sir, you are not a surveyor. You have presented no legal documents to support your claims. The evidence submitted by the defendant is clear and professionally certified. Case dismissed." Brad lost. But it wasn't over yet. After the case was dismissed, I thought that was it. Brad had lost, the judge had ruled in my favor, and life would go back to normal. But if Brad was anything, he was persistent. Losing in court didn't humble him. It enraged him. Brad tries to get the city involved. A week after the case ended, I got a knock on my door. It was a city inspector. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint about my pool, claiming it violated zoning laws and was a danger to the neighborhood. I didn't even have to ask who made the complaint. The inspector was professional but firm. He told me he had to verify my permits and measurements to make sure everything was up to code. Luckily, I had all my paperwork ready. I handed over copies of my approved permits, land survey, and contractor's certification. The inspector looked them over, then took his own measurements. After about 20 minutes, he sighed and shook his head. "Yeah, this is fine. Everything checks out." Then he leaned in a little and lowered his voice. "Between you and me, we get calls from this guy a lot." That's when I found out that Brad was notorious for filing complaints about his neighbors. He had reported someone down the street for painting their house a color he didn't like. Another neighbor had to deal with him calling animal control because their dog barked too much. He had even tried to get the HOA involved in things that weren't even under HOA rules. The inspector told me he was closing the case immediately. I thanked him, and he left. Less than an hour later, I saw Brad standing in his yard, arms crossed, staring at my house. I waved at him with a big smile. He stormed inside. The sprinkler war. After the city shut him down, Brad switched to petty harassment. One morning, I stepped outside to grab the mail and felt the wet slap of cold water hit me in the chest. I looked over. Brad had angled his sprinklers so that they sprayed directly into my driveway and front walkway. I stood there for a second, dripping wet, just staring at him. Brad pretended he didn't see me. That same night, I noticed my backyard was soaking wet. It hadn't rained. My sprinklers hadn't run. Then I saw it. Brad had extended his own sprinkler system so that it sprayed through the gaps in the fence, soaking my yard. I wasn't about to play petty water games with a grown man. I adjusted my own sprinklers, except mine were stronger, had a better angle, and sprayed directly back into his yard. The next morning, I heard him yelling outside. "Brad goes too far." At this point, I was done with him. But then he made a big mistake. One afternoon, I heard a loud bang from my backyard. When I ran outside, I saw Brad standing on a ladder, reaching over my fence with a pole, trying to knock one of my pool lights loose. I was so stunned I just froze. Then he saw me. Brad scrambled off the ladder so fast he nearly fell. He ran back into his house. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. Then I did what I should have done a long time ago. I called the police. Brad finally gets what he deserves. The cops showed up about 30 minutes later. I explained everything, the lawsuit, the complaints, the sprinklers, the trespassing, and now the vandalism attempt. The officers went to Brad's house and knocked. It took a while, but eventually, he answered. And, of course, he played the victim. "I was just fixing my fence," he whined. But when the cops asked why he needed a metal pole to fix his fence, he stumbled over his words. Then they asked if he had permission to be reaching into my yard. That's when he lost it. He started yelling about how I was ruining the neighborhood, lying about the property lines, and stealing his land. One of the officers looked at me and just sighed. "Would you like to press charges?" I had never wanted to say yes more in my life. Brad was charged with trespassing and attempted property damage. The cops warned him that if he did anything else, he'd be facing serious consequences. But even that wasn't the end. Because that's when I found out something that would ruin Brad's life completely. At this point, I thought Brad would finally back off. He had lost in court. He had been caught trying to mess with my pool. The police had charged him with trespassing and warned him that if he pulled anything else, he'd be facing real legal trouble. But if you've learned anything about Brad by now, you know he wasn't capable of letting things go. And then, by complete accident, I found out something that would completely ruin him. A strange conversation at the hardware store. About a week after the sprinkler war and the trespassing incident, I went to a local hardware store to pick up some supplies. I needed some minor repairs done on my fence, and honestly, I wanted to see if I could make it a little taller to keep Brad from pulling any more stunts. While I was at the checkout, I started chatting with the cashier, a guy in his 60s who had been working there for years. He asked where I lived, and when I told him my street, his eyebrows went up. "Oh, you live near that guy, huh?" I laughed. "Brad?" The cashier nodded and leaned in a little. "You know, that guy shouldn't even be living there." That got my attention. "What do you mean?" The cashier glanced around like he was making sure no one was listening. "That house isn't really his. At least, it wasn't supposed to be." Now he had my full attention. I asked him to explain, and that's when I learned that Brad's house had a messy history. The truth about Brad's house. Apparently, Brad wasn't the original owner. The house had actually belonged to his father, who had passed away a couple of years before I moved in. But here's where it gets interesting. Brad had 2 siblings. And according to local gossip, his father had left the house to all 3 kids, meaning they were supposed to sell it and split the money. But Brad? He never told them. Instead, he moved in and claimed the house as his own. His siblings had been fighting him for years, trying to force him to sell the property so they could get their fair share. But Brad had been delaying, lying, and stalling every step of the way. I asked the cashier how he knew all this, and he just shrugged. "It's a small town. People talk." I thanked him, left the store, and immediately started digging into public records. The house wasn't even legally his. It didn't take long to confirm what the cashier had said. Brad's father had passed away without a will, which meant the house legally belonged to all 3 of his children. The property records still listed the house under the father's name, with a legal note that ownership was contested. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, realizing something huge. Brad had spent all this time harassing me over my pool, when he wasn't even supposed to be living there. And that's when the real story twist happened. Because just a few days later, Brad's siblings showed up at my door. Brad's own family turns against him. One evening, I was sitting in my backyard enjoying a beer when I heard knocking at my front door. I opened it to find a man and a woman standing there, both in their 40s, both looking exhausted. The man introduced himself. "Hi, I'm Mike. This is my sister, Anna. We're Brad's siblings." I didn't even try to hide my surprise. "Oh. What can I do for you?" Mike sighed. "Look, we heard about the lawsuit. And the police report. And, well, everything." I raised an eyebrow. "He told you about all that?" Anna laughed bitterly. "Of course not. He lies about everything. We heard from one of the neighbors. I invited them in, and over the next hour, they laid everything out. Brad had illegally taken over the house. He had refused to sell it. He had ignored legal notices from his siblings' lawyers. He was behind on property taxes. They had been trying to force a sale for over 2 years, but Brad kept delaying everything. They were at their breaking point. That's when Mike leaned forward and said something that made my stomach drop. "We think he's trying to claim part of your land because he knows he's going to lose the house. Brad's plan all along." It all started to click. Brad had fought me so hard over my pool because he was desperate. If he could somehow convince a court that part of my property was actually his, he could argue that he had more land to sell. More land meant more value. More value meant more money to fight his siblings in court. It was never about my pool. It was about saving himself from losing everything. But now, I had something his siblings didn't. I had proof that Brad was willing to lie in court to get what he wanted. I told them about his fake property stake, the lawsuit, and the failed city complaint. They were stunned. Then Mike smiled. "I think we just found a way to get him out of there." The perfect revenge plan. The 3 of us started putting together a strategy. Mike and Anna would take Brad back to court, armed with my evidence, proving that he had been trying to scam his way into keeping the house. They would file an official complaint that he had been fraudulently occupying the property while ignoring the other legal owners. I would testify in court about his lies, harassment, and fake legal claims. Brad thought he could steal land from me to save his house. Now, he was about to lose everything. And the best part? He had no idea it was coming. I'll be honest, I didn't think it would happen this fast. After I met with Mike and Anna, I figured it would take months for anything to come of it. I thought Brad would fight every step of the way, dragging things out like he had for years. But I underestimated just how deep of a hole he had already dug for himself. Because barely 3 weeks later, Brad's entire life came crashing down. The court hearing that ended it all. I got a call from Mike. It's happening. Court date is set. Mike and Anna had filed an emergency motion to take control of the house, arguing that Brad was illegally squatting in a home he didn't own. They had proof he had been ignoring legal notices. They had documents showing he was behind on property taxes. And now, thanks to me, they had evidence that Brad had lied in court, which the judge for my lawsuit was more than happy to provide. So, here we were. Inside a packed courtroom, Brad sat at the defendant's table, looking like a man who had just realized the walls were closing in. His lawyer, a different one this time, was flipping through papers with a pinched expression, like even he knew this was a waste of time. And then, in walked Mike and Anna. They had every receipt, every email, every court document. They had copies of the original deed, proving the house was never just Brad's. Then it was my turn. I walked to the witness stand and laid everything out. The fake property stake. The lawsuit that he lost. The city complaints that went nowhere. The trespassing incident. I looked Brad in the eye as I said, he lied under oath to try and steal my property. And he's been lying to his own family for years. Brad was sweating. His hands were gripping the table so hard his knuckles were white. Then came the final nail in the coffin. The county tax records. Brad hadn't paid property taxes in 2 years. Because he wasn't supposed to be living there. The judge looked over the papers, sighed, and then delivered the final blow. The court recognizes that the property in question is co-owned by the plaintiffs. The defendant has no legal claim to remain in the home. He is ordered to vacate the premises within 30 days. It was over. Brad's public meltdown. Brad lost it. I thought he might just slump in his chair, defeated. But no, Brad did what Brad does best. He made a scene. "This is bullsh*t, he screamed, standing up so fast that his chair nearly toppled over. "I've lived in that house for years. You can't just kick me out." Mike didn't even look at him. Anna just shook her head. The judge was not amused. "Mr. Brad, I strongly suggest you sit down before I hold you in contempt of court." But Brad wasn't done. He spun around and pointed at me. "This is your fault," he shouted. "If you had just moved your pool, none of this would have happened." I just stared at him. "Brad, the pool was never on your land." And then he said something that made the whole courtroom go silent. "It should have been." That's when it hit me. He wasn't just trying to scam me. Somewhere in his twisted mind, Brad really believed that he deserved part of my land. That somehow, if he wanted it badly enough, he could just force it to happen. The aftermath, Brad's world falls apart. After the hearing, Brad stormed out of the courtroom. He refused to speak to his siblings. He refused to look at me. But reality hit hard and fast. The eviction notice was served within days. He had 30 days to pack up and leave. Mike and Anna listed the house for sale immediately. The second he was gone, they had contractors lined up to clean and repair the place. The police followed up on his trespassing case. Since he now had a history of lying in court, he wasn't getting a slap on the wrist this time. Brad was losing everything. And then, the final twist. The ultimate pool party. On the day Brad had to leave, I threw a massive pool party. I invited everyone in the neighborhood. Music, food, drinks, it was an all-out celebration. And I made sure to set up the party right in view of Brad's house. I was floating in the pool, drink in hand, when I saw him come outside. He stood on his porch, watching as his old neighbors laughed and cheered, completely ignoring him. Then Mike and Anna pulled up with the moving truck. Brad didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring at everything he had lost. Then he got into his car. And drove away. I didn't feel bad for him. Not even a little. Brad had lied, cheated, and bullied people for years, thinking he could get away with it. In the end, his lies caught up to him. And the best part? Every time I step into my 100% legal pool, I get to remember the day he realized he had lost everything.